It's my pleasure and my honor to introduce a good friend of mine who's spoken all across the globe, Alex Terentiev. He's going to be talking on developing React templates using the SharePoint Framework Library Components. And with that, I will let you take it away, Alex, and I'll put myself on mute and go away for a little bit.
All right, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Alex Terentiev, and welcome to the session Developing React Templates using SharePoint Framework Library Components. And before we start, mark your calendars for the next year, March 23rd to 25th. We will have Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference, previously known as SharePoint Conference, again in Las Vegas, Nevada. So probably we'll be in a good shape for that time. And yeah, maybe see you there. So I also want to thank to all our generous sponsors because they're doing these kind of events possible. And don't forget about the raffle. Submit your answers to win one of 3 Oculus Quest all-in-one. And also consider donating to the following COVID-19 relief funds, United Way and International Medical Corps, and 10% of funds from sponsors go to support community relief as well. A few words about myself. I'm an Office Development MVP, Custom Solutions Architect and Lead Developer in SharePoint List. I have more than 10 years of experience with the SharePoint and extensive experience in front-end development. Currently, I am a Microsoft 365 PNP team member, and I have been 3 times awarded during SharePoint Dev Kitchen Awards by SharePoint Dev Team. It's kind of hackathons. But more important, of course, is social media. So follow me on Twitter, read my blog, visit my GitHub profile, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Few words about the company I'm working for. It's called SharePoint List. We are services and products company. We are specializing on Microsoft 365 ecosystem, and we do custom development, automations, migrations, intranets, and so on and so forth. And also check out our one of our products, Navigator for Teams and SharePoint, that allows you to aggregate data across SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, and display it using rich grouping, filtering, and layout capabilities. And now let's start with the session and today's agenda. First of all, we'll go through SharePoint Framework overview. The next one will overview SharePoint Framework Library Components. Then we will talk about React Basics. And the last one, of course, we'll be talking about React Templates using Library Components. So let's start with the SharePoint Framework overview. So what is SharePoint Framework? The SharePoint Framework is a modern way to develop SharePoint customizations. It's client-side, it's modern, it's mobile-first, it's framework agnostic, meaning that you can use any JavaScript or TypeScript framework you like. It's based on commonly used web development tools, and it can be kind of headache for classic SharePoint developers because we are not in a .NET world anymore. We are in a front-end world. But this actually allows us to bring the latest and greatest from front-end world into SharePoint, and it was actually well overdue. And one more thing I want to mention about the SharePoint framework is that first-party SharePoint components are developed using SharePoint framework as well. And it makes SharePoint framework kind of unique development platform because first-party developers and third-party developers are in the same boat. And I want to talk a little bit more about development toolchain. As I said, we are not in a .NET world, we are in a front-end world, but all the tools that we have for development are pretty similar to what we had in .NET. So, for example, Node.js, it's a hosting and serving environment for JavaScript projects, and it's pretty similar to IIS Express in .NET. NPM is a package manager that allows you to reference external libraries or external modules in your project, and it's pretty similar to NuGet package manager. Webpack is a modules transformer, bundler, and packager. It kind of collects all your TypeScript files, CSS files, compiles them, create chunks that later on will be loaded to the page. Gulp is an extendable task runner. It allows you to create custom tasks and build different routines based on these tasks. So for example, SharePoint Framework build routine is based on Gulp tasks, and we can actually create custom tasks and inject them in SPFx build routine as well. So if you look at the Webpack and Gulp, together they're pretty similar to MS Build in .NET. Yeoman is a templates engine with the generators ecosystem, and you can think of generator as a conditional template. So when you launch a generator, it prompts user with different questions, and based on the answers, it will create the needed template for you. And it's pretty similar to Visual Studio templates. And the last one is a TypeScript. TypeScript is a language you will be using for development, and it's type superset of JavaScript that's pretty similar to C# because it's if you're familiar with JavaScript, it doesn't have like classes, interfaces, all this stuff, but TypeScript actually has. So basically, it's much more easier to implement your solutions using TypeScript rather than JavaScript. And as you can see, there are a lot of new tools, and if you are brand new SharePoint Framework developer, you can have a question like, wow, what should I learn first and what should I think of? So my recommendation would be, of course, you need to learn TypeScript because you will be using this language on day-to-day basis, and you need to know features of the language to be productive and to write performant code, right? The second thing I want to mention here is that NPM is pretty important. You don't need to know how NPM itself works, but you need to know what modules are available in there, what libraries are available in there. For example, if you need to work with dates, you don't want to invent the wheel. You can just use Moment.js, for example, from NPM, reference it in your project and use all the goodness it presents. All other tools, you just need to know a few commands and you'll be good to go. You'll be good to create your project, to debug your project, to package your project and deploy it to SharePoint. So what's currently available in SharePoint Framework? First of all, client-side web parse, and the idea here is the same as in ASP.NET web parse. Web parse is a component that can be added to the page and usually solves some business problem. Good thing about client-side web parse or SharePoint Framework web parse is that they can be added to both classic and modern pages, and they can be added in SharePoint 2016, 2019, and SharePoint Online. And also they work in Microsoft Teams as tabs, and in preview, they work as Outlook add-ins as well. So if you're thinking about developing new web parts for SharePoint, please use SharePoint Framework web parts. Next available thing is extensions, and extensions allow you to extend or customize modern SharePoint UI and modern SharePoint behavior. Currently, there are 4 extensions available. The first one is Application Customizer. It allows you to add a custom header and footer to the page, or you can inject custom JavaScript and CSS to the page using Application Customizer as well. The next one is Command Set Customizer. Command Set Customizer allows you to add custom buttons to list command bar and list items context menu. The next one is Field Customizer that allows you to provide custom rendering for list columns. And the last one is Search Query Modifier that allows you to extend search query before it actually sent to the server. So here in this screenshot, user typed meeting to search for meeting. Before sending it to server, we translated it using Azure to Spanish and Turkish, and we got results for all 3 languages instead of just English, which is pretty cool. Next available thing is library components, and we of course will talk more about library components during this session, but for now you can think of library component like shared code that can be linked or used across any SharePoint Framework solution in your tenant. Minimal path to awesome. So what steps you need to proceed with to create your SharePoint Framework project? First of all, you need to install Node.js and NPM on your machine, and remark here, currently SharePoint Framework supports Node.js version 8 and 10. Next step is to install some IDE where you will be developing your applications, and there are no requirements, I would say, for IDE. It's of course good if IDE supports like syntax highlighting for CSS, for JavaScript, for TypeScript, and IntelliSense, some kind of IntelliSense. I prefer Visual Studio Code because first of all, it's free. It was initially created for front-end development, and most of the examples, demos around SharePoint Framework are demonstrated using Visual Studio Code as well. So even if you prefer some other IDE, it will be good for you to be at least familiar with Visual Studio Code. Next step is to install Yeoman and Gulp to your machine, and this is done using npm. I here in this command is a shortcut for install. -g parameter shows that we are installing modules globally, and they will be available in any folder in your machine. Yo is a shortcut for Yeoman, and Gulp is Gulp. So basically, we are installing two modules. Next step is to install Yeoman SharePoint generator in the same way as we installed Yo and Gulp. So again, we are using npm i-g command, and the name of the module for SharePoint generator is @Microsoft/generator SharePoint. So when all the tools are installed to our machine, they are available, we can navigate to the folder where we want to create our solution and scaffold new project using SharePoint generator. It's done using yo command for Yeoman, and we are starting our generator using @Microsoft/SharePoint. So as I mentioned, generator will prompt you with multiple questions. So for example, what is the name of your solution? Do you want to create a web part, extension, or library component? Do you want to use React framework, Knockout, or plain TypeScript, and so on and so forth? And when you answer all the questions, the Yeoman generator will create a project for you. If you are creating the first ever project on this specific machine, you also need to trust the self-signed developer certificate. It will allow you to debug your SharePoint Framework solutions locally using local server and local browsers. So this is done using gulp trust_dev_cert command. And the last step is to actually run the project with gulp serve command. It will run local server, start local server. It will launch default browser, and in the browser, it will open a so-called workbench page that allows you to add your custom web part in there and debug it locally without even connection to SharePoint. So you can have some mock data in there, and in that case, you don't need to have a connection to SharePoint. So that's all I have for SharePoint Framework overview, and if there are any questions, I don't see any. Okay, so I believe we can go further. And yeah, feel free to post questions in the Q&A section. I'll be trying to answer them. So let's dig into some details of SharePoint Framework library components. So library component allows you to have independently versioned and hosted SPFx code. So basically, it's kind of still SharePoint Framework project. Because of that, you can have still separate versions for that, and you can deploy it separately from anything else. Library components are hosted and served automatically for other SPFx components where they are referenced. And we will talk a little bit more about how you can reference the library components. But still, if they're referenced in any other SPFx solution, they will be automatically popped out from or served from your app catalog. So you deploy your library component to tenant app catalog, and after that, you can link it in any other SharePoint Framework solution. And you can ask, like, wait, we have CDN. Why do we need library components? And well, yes, that's true. You have CDN, and library component is just an alternative option to have shared code. So it's up to you if you want to use that. Maybe you have some scenarios where CDN is better. Maybe you have some scenarios where library components are better. And there are some limitations for library components I want to point here. First of all, you can't host multiple different versions of the component at the same time. It's, by the way, also applicable for any other SharePoint Framework solution that is hosted on Office 365 CDN. So you should keep it in mind when you deliver new version of library component. You must support previous versions code as well. So you must not provide breaking changes, because you can have multiple web parts or multiple extensions, SharePoint Framework extensions that use this library component. And if you bring something break into this library component, all your web parts, all extensions will be broken. So keep it in mind. The next one, solution with library component cannot contain any other component type. So you can mix and match web parts and extensions in one single solution. But if you want to create library component solution, you cannot add web parts or extensions in there. And library components are not supported when they are deployed to site collection app catalog. So basically, you need your solution, your library component solution, as well as web part solution will be using the library component, both installed to tenant level app catalog. Create, deploy, and use library component. So the creation and process of library component of deployment is pretty similar to any other SPFx solution. First, we are scaffolding our project using Yeoman generator, and then when the Yeoman asks us about what type of client-side component do we want to create, we're selecting library. Next step is, of course, implement your custom logic. And when it's done, we need to package our solution, upload the solution to tenant app catalog, and then you can reference the component library either in a package.json or dynamically in the code using SP component loader. So in the demo later on in this session, I will show you how to work with SP component loader. But yeah, keep in mind that you can just open package.json file of your SharePoint Framework web part or extension or solution and just add your library in dependencies section of the package.json file. Now let's talk about React basics. And I want to provide some basic statements about React that will help you to think in React way, which is really important when you start developing things in React, because React is a little bit different from other available libraries. For example, if you're familiar with something like Knockout or Vue.js, these libraries are mostly based on model view controller or model view model templates, but in React case, it's not the same. So first of all, when you're building React apps, you're building encapsulated components. Components can be, of course, included one in another and communicate with each other, but still, each component is kind of standalone entity. Next, React re-renders. It does not mutate. So it means that if something has changed, your component will be completely re-rendered. And you can think like, wow, it should be pretty slow, but no, it's not slow. First of all, React effectively updates and renders only needed components. And the second, it is based on fast virtual DOM. And probably when you heard about that somebody is talking about React, you heard about state and props, right? So state object is used to provide controls internal data or internal behavior, and props are used to pass data and events from parents to children. And a good simple example of props and state is the drop-down component. And in drop-down component, items and item selection handler are passed as props, and drop-down expanded collapsed is just an internal state of your drop-down. So how to implement a component? First, we need to reference React and React DOM in our project. Second, we use .jsx or .tsx files to implement the logic and markup. You can use plain JavaScript or TypeScript files if you want, but JSX, TSX, by the way, JavaScript extended and TypeScript extended. They are more convenient. And all the markup that is rendered by your component should be returned from render method of your class. Next one, change in props and state lead to components re-render, and I already mentioned that. If you are using lowercase text, this will be interpreted as default HTML. So, for example, div, span, header, and so on and so forth. If you are using mixed case text, these are custom components. Events in React are camel-cased, not lowercase as in usual HTML. And instead of passing a name of the function, you should pass a whole function as an event handler. So let me actually show you the simple React component and how it behaves. So first, let me show you my browser here. And it's pretty simple application where we have like my first React app, so some text, and we have a button here. If I click on the button, we have an alert with the number of clicks set to 0 because we are in development mode, so 0 is kind of 1. If I click it again, it will be incremented to be 1, and so on and so forth. So now I will show you the code of that simple component. So let me make it a little bit bigger. So I have one my component, custom component, the other one is app component, and inside app I also using like div, header, and my custom component. And actually I want to, and by the way, yes, one more thing to show you, in package.json file I have React and React DOM reference. So basically this is mandatory to use React in your solution. So let me go back to the presentation, and here I have the same code on this slide that I just showed you in the Visual Studio Code. And here we have all the principles we just discussed. So first of all the markup is returned from a render method of the component. Next one, we can use lowercase text for default HTML components like div and header. In that case, we use mixed case text for custom components. For the on-click event handler, we are using camel case like an on-click, and we are providing the whole function as a handler. And inside this handler, you can see that we are using both props and state. So from props, we are getting text that was provided by the parent. And we're also using state that is kind of number of clicks. It's an internal state that we are changing every time when the button has been clicked. OK, any questions now? What is the good resource to learn TypeScript besides TypeScript.org site? So from free ones, I would say it's the best one. From the ones that you can pay for, check Andrew Connell course around TypeScript and SharePoint Framework. It's not cheap, but it's really, 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 really good. So I would recommend that. The second one, does SPFx manifest version have any bearing on package.json? No, unfortunately, you should provide. So first of all, manifest version of the web part just displays the version of JSON schema. So you have separate version in package.json file and another version in package -solution.json, which is kind of configuration for packaging your SharePoint Framework solution. And unfortunately, right now, they're not connected one to other. So you can provide your custom gulp task, which is actually what I'm usually doing. So you're doing your custom gulp task that will take the version from package.json file and apply the same version to package.json, package-solution.json in SPFx. In that case, they will be like aligned. Right. So let's go to React templates and React templates using library components. So first, let's identify the problem. So developers often need to create different UI for different customers, different surfaces, scenarios, behaviors, and so on and so forth. Plain HTML and most of libraries like Handlebar.js usually allow you to define static templates. You can pass data into these templates, but it can be tricky to handle events from these templates, implement some internal logic, etc. And there are some additional questions like how can I use external event handlers with templates? How to inject these templates into React? How to load them using in my SPFx components? And how can I have the type check-in if I'm using the TypeScript? So the solution here is library components plus React or React plus library components. And I want to provide some implementation details before we jump to the demo and write in some code. So first of all, as I mentioned, any mixed case tag is a custom component in React. So it means that we can define some uppercase variable and we can use it as a tag, which is really cool. React is also providing us with the React.component class interface. And this interface allows you to specify the type of props that will be passed to your React component. And because of that, you will have type checking inside your TypeScript. Library components are just SPFx projects with all the configurations available. So basically, you can reference React in there, which is important for React templates. You can use Office UI Fabric React support in there, or Fluent UI, sorry, in there. You can use PNP reusable controls, so whatever you want. Next one, SP component loader. So any library component is still a component, SPFx component. So we can use SP component loader and especially load component by ID method to load our library dynamically to any SPFx solution. And if we know the contract or what is exported or exposed by the library component, we can use it in our solution. So basically, we can just reference some properties from our library and we are good to go. And now let's actually switch to the codes. Before doing that, I want to just show you what we will be creating. So I have a web part that has a list in it. And when we select some item in the list, we are displaying the properties for this item underneath the list itself. So what I want to do, I want to allow user to provide component ID for custom library component that will render our list like that. So basically, list is the same, but for details of the item or of the task, we are using Office UI Fabric panel here. So let me jump to the code. And I believe it's this one. Let me put it here. So in the code here in the solution, I have actually two SharePoint Framework projects. One is task details template, which is our library. And let's go and see what it is right now. So it's just scaffolded by default. One difference with default scaffolding that I have here is that in our package.json, I have already referenced React, React DOM, and all the types as well as Office UI Fabric React. But anything else is just default. So right now we have some class in here with a single name, and that's all that is exported from our library component. The other project here is our tasks web part. And in this web part, currently, I have two components, one task details, another tasks. So tasks is used to display a list, and task details currently just display the this not panel, but div underneath the list. So what we will be doing first in our library component, we will implement custom React component that will render the same task details, but inside Office UI Fabric panel. And then in our tasks web part, we will provide ability to reference this library component and select if we want to render our details underneath the list or using a panel. Okay, so let me go to my library component here, and in this task details folder, I will create components folder. In components, let's add task details. It's not important to not required to add all this folder, but it's just a good practice to have this kind of structure. And I will add task details TSX file, which will be our component. And I also want to have some styles for the component. So let me add task details module as CSS. Okay, and mostly I will be copying the code from existing task details that I have. So first of all, I will copy the whole CSS from here. And I will change few things. So flex direction, I want it to be row. It will be more beautiful in panel. And the second one, instead of padding, I want to have margin because I want to have like actual margins between the panel itself and our content. So CSS is implemented. Now let's copy some code from task details TSX in here. I will copy that. Move it here. And one thing here, I don't have task details props in the model because I don't have this model class or model file in my library component. So I will grab these iTask and iTask details props and also copy them to our file instead of this import. Okay. And what we also want to do, we don't want to just display the div. We want to display a panel from Office UI Fabric. So let me add import. I'll be importing panel component from Office UI Fabric lib panel. Okay. Oops. Let me go back. Where are you? Here we go. So let's save it. And now we can go here in our render method where we are providing our markup for the component. And if we have some task, instead of rendering just div, I will add panel in here. And header text will be something like, let's say, task details. And I also want to show that our panel is open. Okay, and all these markup that I copied will be just children of my panel. Okay, so we have implemented our React component, which was pretty simple, especially as we can copy paste some markup, some code. Now we should go to our task details library.ts file, which is kind of entry point to our library component. And instead of exporting this task details library class, we will export task details, our component from components, task details. And one more thing to do for the library component, we also have this index.ts method. If you are familiar with front-end development, usually index.ts is a kind of entry point to your whole solution. So again, here it's exporting the class that we just deleted. So instead of task details library, we'll be exporting our task details component. So basically, that's all I need to do to implement React component in SPFx library component. And the next step is actually deploy to our app catalog. And I have already done that because there are some connectivity issues when I'm trying to deploy everything. So I should have it right here. Let me check the name in the manifest. Task details library, and in the config package solution, task details template, right? So this will be the name of the solution. Let me check that it's actually here. Yes, here is our task details template component. So it is already deployed to our tenant app catalog. It means that now we can implement our web part and we can reference this component, this library component in our web part. So let's go back to our code. I will close that. I will collapse that. And here is our web part. So first, let's work with the web part itself to allow user to provide the component ID that we will be loading. And then we will use SP component loader to actually load this component. So first, we have our property pane configuration. Again, right now is just by default. It provides information about the description for web part. But instead of that, I want to have component ID property in here, and label will be component ID. Okay, now I can modify our web part, and it will have component ID instead of the description. And next, we can use this component ID to actually load the component from our tenant app catalog. For that, I'll be using SP component loader that you need to import from Microsoft SP loader module. And because user can change properties dynamically, like reactively, it means that in our render method, we need to check component ID all the time when the web part is rendered. And SP component loader.load component by ID is, by the way, asynchronous operation. It means that our render method should be asynchronous as well. And it is possible in SharePoint frameworks to do so. First, we need to overwrite the render async property, which returns Boolean, and we should return true. In that case, SharePoint framework itself, SharePoint framework core, will understand that our render method is asynchronous, and it will wait until it's ended. So now let's change our render method. I will mark it with async, and it will return promise void instead of just void. And to notify SharePoint framework that render has finished, we should call this render completed. Okay, now inside that method, we can use SP component loader to load our component. But what if, for example, user did not provide component ID? In that case, we can use our task details from the same web part, right? So let me reference it here. Import task details from, I have it in components, task details. Okay, and now in render method, we will set our task details component by default to task details. But if we have component ID set in our properties, we will load our library. So we will do that using SP component loader, load component by ID. And here we are providing this ID from our properties, this properties component ID. Okay, and when our library is loaded, if you remember, we exported from our library, we exported the only property in our index, task details. So what we can do here, we can say like, hey, our task details component is equal to lib task details. And we also can have type checking in here and do React component class of type I task details props. Okay. So what's okay? Yeah, because lib is currently unknown because I didn't provide the type of it, so it will be of type any. Okay, and this one, I need to provide the type for my component as well. Okay, now when we loaded the component, we want to use it in our tasks component, which is basically the one that displays the task details as well when the item is selected. So I will modify the props for this component to provide task details component property, which will be again React component class task details props. And I need to reference React in here, so let me copy it like that. Okay, now in the web part, we can provide our component in the creation of our tasks object. So task details component will be equal to our task details component. Cool. Now let's go to our tasks.tsx component. And currently, if you look at it, we have our list, and if there is a selected index, we are rendering task details. And currently, task details is just imported from our default implementation. So I will comment this one. And inside render method, what I will do, I will create a variable. And as I said, if it's a mixed case, we can use variable as a tag. So I will create task details variable. And I will do like that. This props task details component. And if you look here, we don't have any errors. Moreover, we are providing props to our components. So we have type checking. If I hover over these tasks, it has iTask as a type for the property, right? So we have type checking in the TypeScript. We are dynamically loading our component, and it's a React component, which is really, really cool. Okay, so hopefully we don't have any errors, and I will be able to launch the solution. So here is my console, and I will do gulp serve no browser. Gulp serve no browser will launch local server, but it will not launch default browser because I want to test it on my tenant, in my SharePoint tenant, because the library component is installed in the tenant. It's not local, right? So for that purposes, I'll use Workbench that is hosted inside SharePoint, and you can reference it in any site, in any SharePoint site using layouts 15 workbench.spx. So let me refresh it, and we should have our tasks web part in here. So by default behavior, we have list, we have details underneath the list. So let me click on our properties for the web part. As you can see, we have this component ID, and right now it's empty. So in our code, if we navigate to our library component, and if we navigate to our manifest of the library component, we see the ID in there. And basically, this is the ID of our component. This is the ID we can use. So let me go back, and hopefully it works. Yay, it works. So as you can see, right after I added a component ID to the property pane, we see the details in the panel instead of underneath the list. So again, if I want to remove it, I remove it, and we see the details again as it was in out-of-the-box implementation. So it's pretty dynamic. You can create multiple different UIs, multiple different behaviors. You can use these behaviors dynamically using SP component loader. You can load them at any time you want, or even provide the some UI to your users to do that, to make the selection. And I mean, not like end users, but probably power users, the ones that are editing the pages. So pretty cool, right? And we have type check, and we have everything we expect to have in the SharePoint Framework solutions. So let me jump back to the presentation. And the last thing I want to point here are the resources. And the resources are across SharePoint Framework, across React, and especially library components. So first link is SPFx overview, so it's general SharePoint Framework overview. The next one is SharePoint Framework dev tutorials, where you can find tutorials how to develop this or that, and library component tutorial is part of that as well. And you can also see how to develop, like, for example, team steps using SPFx and so on and so forth. The next one is React documentation to start with React.js. The next one is Microsoft 365 PNP community. And if you're not familiar with the PNP, you must be familiar, especially as SharePoint developer, because it provides tons of helpful materials, reusable components, reusable solutions, videos, blog posts, and so on and so forth. So it simplifies your life very, very, very well. And not only for developers, but for end users, for admins, and for everybody. The next one is a blog post about React templates using SPFx Library Components that I wrote, and basically it's a little bit more extensive than the current session because I have only 50 minutes to provide all the material here. The next two are demos or samples. The first one is exact demo from this session. So basically you can grab this code and use it. The next one is more complex sample of React templates where we are mixing and matching both list and task details as well. We can load both of them and as different templates, for example. The next one is a good blog post by Stefan Bauer on library components tips and tricks. And also David Warner, the second blog post with great posts around library components as well. And saying that, yes, and of course I will share the presentation and the link to the code to the GitHub on Twitter and tag it with M365VN hashtag. So that's all I had for today. Thank you for joining us, and if there are any questions, I will answer them right away.
Thank you so much, Alex. I appreciate it. As we have probably a minute or two for if there's any questions. If not, please feel free to go over to the community zone, and I'm going to post the link to the community zone in the chat. And feel free to go over there if there's any additional questions.
Yep, and feel free to connect with me on any social media I provided as well. I usually try to answer the questions there as well.
Thank you so much, Alex. You have a great day. Hope you're doing well.
Thank you, Rick. Have a great day, and everyone who attended, have a great day as well. Thank